think as Africans, we must have agency to become owners and developers of the technology, because if technology is not cascaded to cultural context, to indigenous realities, it can become a tool for oppression as well. Alright, good morning everyone. I hope you're all doing well.
Good morning.
So I'm Rakkel Andreas, and I will be moderating today's session of Read with Daisry. And we are getting into the deep. We're just heading in there, straight ahead. We're starting off with The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. I don't know how many of you have actually, by show of hands, how many of you have read the book? 3, 4, 5. Nice, I like that. How many of you have Googled and pulled up a review online? Love the honesty in the room. Love it, love it. But anyway, so in today's session with Read with Daisry, Ms. Daisry Mathias, the youth Presidential Youth Advisor on Youth and Enterprise Development. She will basically be doing the review on this wonderful book for us today. I don't want to take the thunder from there and sort of take you into what she will be doing, but she'll do that herself. And then after that, because now when I read the room, I realized that most of you have an idea on what the book is all about. We will be sort of deliberating on a few reflections that we picked up from the book as we've read it. And then after that, I will invite you all in so that we can just have a conversation around some of the themes that Ms. Daisry is going to share with us. So without wasting more time, let's get into this exciting review of today. Ms. Mathias, the opportunity is all yours. Thank you, Rakkel, for that introduction, and for all of you for honoring our invitation to our kickoff event for our reading year. This is also the very first time that we are able to meet as a community in person. We started this reading group in March 2021, just around as we're entering the third wave of COVID, and it was impossible for us to have physical meetings, so we used to do it virtually. And the community has been growing since, and we've read a lot of literature over the last year, and we're continuing into our second series this year. We're going to continue with modern African literature contexts, and we'll be covering 12 different authors, 12 different books over the course of the year. It's a standing commitment. We read a book a month. We meet on the last Saturday of every month, and we just exchange in knowledge, in reflections, in perceptions, in interpretation, and our understanding of the world as we see it. And every month I share the recommended title on my social media channels. So you're welcome to just follow and see what we're reading that month. And then it's not compulsory, it's not a membership based. You can come and go as you please. And if you miss the physical session or the virtual session, you always have the option to watch the concluded reviews on our Land Youth Advisor YouTube channel. I just want to acknowledge the presence of our Minister of Justice, who walked in quietly in the back. We appreciate your presence, Honorable Dausa. So like I said, this is a standing commitment. We are here to pursue knowledge, and we do this through intellectual exchanges. We seek to engage and to learn from the contributions of so many diverse forces that are around us. This year we're going to continue to shine the spotlight on African literature, telling and reading our own stories and celebrating outstanding African authors whose names we need to know. We also do this so that we can embrace a culture of reading as young Africans, as young Namibians, as young leaders, and to support the literary arts, which is an important economic sector that can contribute to sustainable livelihoods. And of course, last but not least, we do this because we want to inspire a new generation of young Namibians and young Africans to read, to reimagine tomorrow, and also for us to be able to tell our own stories. So our conversations over the last year have certainly helped me to inform and to shape my worldview in terms of determining what is the spirit of the age that we're living in, the zeitgeist essentially. And we examine the forces that are shaping not only our present day realities, but also that are shaping tomorrow, because we want to be active participants in shaping our shared destiny. It is for me an honor, it's a blessing, it's a privilege to have this opportunity then to engage you this morning, and you're all very welcome. I just want to indicate that there is space up front if you want to get a bit closer. There's some seats that are open. So let me begin by introducing the author and the book that we're reading today. The author for today's book, Frantz Fanon, was an Afro-Caribbean who was born in 1925 in the French colony of Martinique. He was educated as a PhD in psychiatry, but he marked his generation through his work and his writings as a socio-political philosopher. Fanon died 60 years ago in Washington, D.C. in December 1961 from leukemia at the age of just 36. And today's book, The Wretched of the Earth, was his final text, his final installment, and it was republished last year in 2021 to mark the 60th publication anniversary of The Wretched of the Earth. Fanon has also written other well-known books like Black Skin, White Masks, but Wretched of the Earth is definitely his seminal work, and it is the keystone book on colonialism, which provides a political justification for resistance and armed struggle, which has influenced so many anti-colonial movements across the continent, and particularly in southern Africa, where we have the white settler colonies. It includes Namibia, Botswana, South Africa. Not Botswana, Zimbabwe, South Africa. Fanon is rated amongst the greatest revolutionary intellectuals in the 20th century. But it's argued because it depends on the context. Some will say that Mao Zedong was the greatest intellectual revolutionary who managed to lead revolutions in the East and lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But I think context matters, and in our context of white supremacy, colonialism, and oppression, I would definitely argue that he remains amongst the most relevant intellectuals and thinkers, at least for the 21st century. So, in terms of contextual framing, this book was written in 1961, and I just want us to have an appreciation of what was happening in the world around and the continent around the time that this book was written. To take you all back to 1884-85, we all know the Bismarck Conference that was convened in Berlin by the German Chancellor Bismarck. And that was really the conference that led to an alliance of expansionist European powers who decided to arbitrarily portion off countries, not according to their heritage, not according to their common identity, but really they wanted to create colonial empires and just to put a flag on the different territories. And this is what sparked the scramble for Africa as a treasure trove. In the late 1950s and early 60s, Africa became the decade of independence, and we saw the rise to sovereignty. The first country that became independent in Africa was Ghana in 1958, and after that at least 30 other countries followed, including Cameroon, Chad, so many others attained their political liberation. So The Wretched of the Earth is published in this era of 1960, where there's a wind of change and there's a sweeping liberation movement on the continent that was marked by Ghana first under Kwame Nkrumah. And through this book, it's a powerful call by Fanon and a very passionate call for him to invite and encourage the people of Africa to revolt, to rise up and to cast off colonization by the European powers. Fanon was concerned about the end of the age of the European empire, which, you know, Christopher Columbus came into Africa and made that discovery, and then Spain had a very dominant empire, and also towards the end of the Second World War was the persecution of the Jews with the concentration camps, and all of that is really what premised him to want to see the end and the demise of the European colonial empire, which is imperialist and very dominant. So today's conversation on Frantz Fanon's positive influence around the world, and specifically on our continent and in our context as a country, you know, it will help us to look at the content around national liberation and revolution in today's world, because the world has changed, but we're still going through cycles of revolution. As conditions in the global south, we've seen what has happened with the pandemic, with the vaccine. We have seen how deeply entrenched the power dynamics are, how deeply entrenched economic inequalities are amongst the nations of the world. We are still really in a process of engaging economic liberty, economic emancipation, and facilitating those drivers for transformation in the 21st century and for Namibians and Africans as we know them today. So history has always shown that when there is a political and an economic crisis that are meeting and they coincide, it can become a source for social fragility, it can become a source for social upheaval, and that is usually what heightens the potential for revolution. So I think as national leaders, we are interested to obviously engage these factors, these forces, the very drivers that could undermine our unity, that could undermine our political stability, that could undermine the progress that we have made, not only as a country, but as a continent. We've seen what has happened with the Arab Springs, with such unsustainable high levels of unemployment, particularly youth unemployment. And these are the very drivers that can lead to a disenchantment, a disenfranchisement, and that attitude of there's nothing left to lose. And I think Fanon covers that quite a lot. That is the very premise of the book. So let's get into the book review. I'm now going to move into the book by providing an overview of the structure of the book and the content. He wrote from the perspective of the colonized during the latter stages of the European colonialism, and he discussed how and why colonialism must be stopped. That is what The Wretched of the Earth is about. And this book has got 5 chapters and the conclusion, and the first chapter speaks on violence as a theme. At the very beginning of the text, Fanon begins by invoking a biblical scripture, which is Matthew 20, verse 16, which says, "The first shall be last, and the last shall be first." And decolonization is verification of this. This is what he says. Fanon believed that violence was justified in overthrowing colonial oppression. Fanon argued that, and I quote unquote, "the colonized man liberates himself through violence. The practice enlightens the militant because it shows him the means to the end and the end." Fanon asserts that colonizers have already planted the seeds of their own violent overthrow, where the settlers have been mistreated and where they make the natives to feel like animals, which they did by perpetrating acts of violence against the indigenous people. So the natives, however, would come to a point in a realization that they need to resist the subjugation, and they will have to fight to realize for their humanity, their dignity, and their human rights, essentially. They decided to engage in armed struggle towards their decolonization, towards their self-determination, and in order for them to reclaim what they had lost, including to reclaim their land. Fanon justified the act of violence for 2 reasons. He believed that colonization is in itself an act of violence, which is sustained by a continued threat. And secondly, Fanon argues that under colonialism, the native, non-white, or the black person is forced into a second-class citizenship. They are denied education, economic opportunities, and they do not receive respect. And this warrants a violent resistance. Fanon argues that the colonial infrastructure must therefore be destroyed, and that the colonizer must be driven out by force in order for the oppressed to make a new state. So that's the introduction of the text. The premise is that it is by violence. And with the Honorable Minister of Justice here, one of the words that she has said is that power does not concede without a demand, which I think rings true through this text. The second part of the chapter is that he shifts the focus to violence within the international context, and really looking at the geopolitics and the power dynamics, describing the international political relationships that exist between newly formed nation states and the colonial powers. And if you look at Africa, 24 of our 56 now countries on the continent are Francophone. So there's a very, very strong dominance of the French colonial power. But we also have German heritage, and there's the Lusophone with the Portuguese and the Anglophones. So he looks at these relationships between the new nation states and the colonial powers. And according to Fanon, colonizing nations always enrich themselves at the expense of the colonized, by taking over the land, the means of production and resources, and reducing the indigenous people in that territory to slaves. Fanon argues that colonial powers owe their former colonies reparation payments for the pain and the trauma that they have inflicted on the people. Let's move to the second chapter of the book, which looks at spontaneity, the strengths and the weaknesses thereof. Here, Fanon argues that the peasants who are of low social status who are in the countryside, in the rural areas, are more resolute and they are more anti-colonial and they are actually more determined to rid themselves of colonialism than the middle class bourgeois. Help me pronounce that word? Bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie. The middle class bourgeoisie. Who are less, he finds them to be less reliable, and he feels that, he believes that their main interest is actually not to destroy the colonial power, but rather just for a power shift, so that they can take over the position of being masters of the masses. Fanon believed that the struggle would begin first with the rural peasantry who suffered most from colonialism. So he was really in solidarity with those who were in the rural hinterlands. The urban bourgeoisie, although they were natives to the land, he believed that they managed to retain a measure of status, they managed to retain a measure of wealth because they had colonial privileges and they had some control over the peasantry. This is the middle class that was educated and within the working colonial administration and professional. For Fanon, a movement by the urban bourgeoisie would lead to a compromise and would not be much more different and would still rely on a colonizer and rural exploitation. So he was not persuaded in the authenticity or the legitimacy or even the solidarity of the middle class to really represent the interests of the rural masses. For Fanon, this was hardly a revolution, as the system would remain similar or the same. For the system to change properly and entirely, it had to be torn down completely from the outside, and he believed it needed to be reconstructed to reflect the image of the oppressed. However, the actions of the peasants, he concedes, need to be organized into a single national unity with sound political programming. So they need other people to come in to help them in order for them to wage the struggle against colonialism. And I want you to mark that note because I find that there's possibly a contradiction or some kind of conflict in that concession, as much as it is correct and true. In chapter 3, Fanon analyzes the pitfalls of national consciousness, zooming into the social class of the bourgeoisie. The nationalist bourgeoisie is dominated by the educated middle class, the lawyers, the doctors, the teachers, the colonial administrators. They are characterized to be self-serving, self-motivated, and motivated by self-interest. And this drives them to maintain the old structures of oppression only with themselves at the top. So he perceives them and characterizes them to be defenders of the status quo. The solution, according to Fanon, is to deal with the bourgeoisie by decentralizing and cascading and transferring authority into the extreme and into the masses at the grassroots level. He makes a case for the hinterlands, which is the rural areas in the countryside, to become integrated into the cities. He criticizes the post-colonial government for maintaining the same political structures simply with a change of face. Fanon also describes the conditions in which tribalism and xenophobia triumph and thrive amongst the natives due to the failure of the ruling middle class. Fanon is adamant that a true state of decolonization is one that will bring the entire political system of decolonization into question. The new administration cannot simply continue where the old settler oppressor left off. There must be genuine, radical, fundamental change where there is complete control of the economy and the forces of production by the masses, and stopping the umbilical cord that sustains and develops other countries instead of our national interests. So he argues that colonial infrastructure must be destroyed totally with a change of regime. In chapter 4, Fanon concentrates on national culture, identity, and he continues his charge against the bourgeoisie and the long-term psychological, spiritual, and social impacts caused by colonialism. Fanon argues here that this, and I quote unquote, the struggle to create the nation will give rise to the national culture, which I think is quite a profound statement that we can reflect on later. In favor of ensuring a national culture that is both political and economic, he believes that the class struggle must triumph over the hunger for an alternative, that everybody must be able to participate in the society so that you do not have a situation where the previously oppressed become dominated again. He is in solidarity with the oppressed people, and he believes that by being intentional about which lens we look at the world through, we are able to mitigate the betrayal of the bourgeoisie to the working and the poor people. And one of this is by guarding against predatory capitalism. In the last chapter, chapter 5, Fanon becomes very personal. The previous chapters are all written in narrative style, but in this chapter he shares his real medical experiences and medical cases of some of the patients that he was treating, and the impacts of the trauma that was inflicted by the colonial oppression on these people. He drew from his experiences because he was a psychiatrist, and he consulted patients in hospitals in Algeria, where he worked actively as a participant in that revolutionary struggle to fend off French rule, but also he worked in Tunisia. Fanon demonstrates a depth of understanding of how the sustained denigration impacted the mentality, the psyche of the oppressed people, and he also unpacks the trauma on their mental health, where he sees that it has evolved into suicidal tendencies, into anxiety, and some homicidal actions. So he really evaluates the long-term effects on the psyche and the soul of an oppressed person. He also looks at its effect on criminality, which becomes one of the methods where the natives, avoiding confrontation with the settlers, they turn to thievery and crime. They find themselves in lack, in poverty, they're suffering in silence, and these are all symptoms and become the aftermath of the effects of oppression and colonialism and how it had an ability to crush the human spirit, soul, and mind. Fanon concludes The Wretched of the Earth with a rousing call to action, where he advises those liberated, decolonized nations. Remember, by 58, Ghana was independent, Cameroon, Chad, a few other countries around the time that he was writing had obtained their political emancipation. So he cautions and he advises those decolonized nations to turn away from Europe, to guard against trying to catch up with Europe economically and culturally, to avoid the colonial blueprint and to forge their own path economically, politically, and culturally. And he believes that when they do that, the liberation of the colonized would be sustained. The liberation of the previously colonized would be sustained. And he ends by saying that we must shake off that great mantle of night which had enveloped us and reach for the light. So in my personal conclusion, as I come to the end of my review, this was the first time that I was reading this book of Fanon, and I don't understand why it took me so long to read The Wretched of the Earth, because it's quite a renowned, prominent book, especially for those who do philosophy and politics. But I think I can only attribute it to my education, because my secondary education was more on the Cambridge side, and we focused on English literature. We were reading George Orwell, Animal Farm, and Watership Down. So you can imagine that there was a lack of consciousness and I think awakening on the African literature. Secondly, I also just didn't do politics and philosophy in university. But I think there's an intersection between politics, economic transformation that is engineered through the politics of liberation and resistance. Personally and symbolically, I mean, at just the age of 36, Fanon had marked his generation. He had a very short but intense life and contribution. He died on the 6th of December, and that's when we celebrated his 60th death anniversary, the 60th publication of The Wretched of the Earth. And personally, in December, I celebrated my 36th birthday. So I don't think it's a coincidence that we're starting off the year by reflecting on Fanon, because I think that this is really a seminal text that is still very relevant to our generation in the 21st century, and we can seek guidance in responding to some of the challenges that face us. Fanon is famously quoted for saying that each generation must discover their mission, fulfill it or betray it in relative opacity. And I think as young people, young Namibians, young Africans, we are still engaged in that exercise of defining our generational mission. We understand that it's economic emancipation. We understand that it's the third stage, the third phase of the struggle. But in terms of identifying the forces that are against us, which are more invisible now, it's disease, it's virus, it's economic, it's unemployment, it's poverty, it's patriarchy, it's tribalism and xenophobia. The forces are different, but I believe we're still waged in a liberation struggle, this time for economic liberty. Secondly, as I consumed this text, and when the fire hit, it became clear to me that Fanon loved black people, that he loved the oppressed, the poor, the working class, and that he was in solidarity with the people. And I think that this is an important virtue and value for leadership, that there must be solidarity, there must be empathy, there must be compassion. And I believe these are the people that he was describing in the title, The Wretched of the Earth. When I looked at the title of the book, you know, the title is quite provocative, and I thought, but who are the wretched? And I believe these are the wretched of the earth, according to his definition. Fanon is an important part of this era, but I think he remains an important voice to our generation. And as we continue to learn and to draw from him and that generation, as we shape and define our own voices in the world around us, I think our generation has a duty and an obligation to reflect on how best to position ourselves relative to Fanon and others in Namibia, on the continent, in the 21st century, through the lens of the struggles of the masses, of the people, of ourselves, our generation, and also the sufferings and the undoings of the oppressed people. When President KICKOFF said that no one should be left behind in the Namibian house, it's a personal call for each one of us to reflect, to look left and right in our relational constellations, in our communities, in our society, and to gauge who is at most risk of being left behind. And we have an obligation, I believe, to go after those people and to ensure that we remove the shackles that would be limiting them from realizing their fullest and truest potential. I think the brilliance of Fanon in general, but also demonstrated through The Wretched of the Earth, is his understanding that you have to address the psychological scars at the same time as you're dealing with the economic misery. And I think as Namibians, we can really relate to this as a post-conflict society. I think there's still a lot of scars that we are not yet, we're still healing from in the process of, and sometimes it manifests itself in our society through our social cultural behavior, our levels of tolerance and social cohesion. And he put it forward that you have to deal with the spiritual violations of a people as well, and at the same time as you deal with the institutions that are limiting and excluding and marginalizing them. So we have to do both in tandem. You know, some of the contradictions that I picked up had to do with the political armed struggle, or rather his disdain for the educated bourgeoisie. He patently acknowledges that the peasantry need to be organized. There's a need for leadership. There's a need for enlightenment. There's a need for capacity. And you know, the quality and the pedigree of Fanon, he himself was an elite middle-class bourgeoisie. He was part of that ruling middle class. And I believe that it cannot be binary. I believe that you need to have a combination. The more enlightened the society is, the better it is for the leadership, the better it is for society at large. And I believe that maybe this is one area that we need to decolonize is the education and, you know, the politics around pursuing knowledge, information, and enlightenment. And also the call on the first to be last and the last to be first. It's biblical and it has its context. But I think when you take it politically, it could also perpetuate vicious cycles of revolution, because it creates a confrontation, it creates an anger, it creates a demand that it's my turn now, and I'm last today and I must become first, and it can really create cycles of revolution. And I think even in our age, it even validates cancel culture, because it allows you to dominate and to silence others and to superimpose yourself on others. I think it's fitting that we're discussing this text in January, at the beginning of a new year, but also a fairly new decade, which the president this year has been the year of re-imaging. And when we really unpack what the president means by re-imaging, it's about creating a new mental model, It's about envisioning a different future, a different reality for our country, our prospects in the short term, but also in the long term. But it's also about trust and creating mental models that are built in good faith and in trust or optimism for a better tomorrow. So our country is in a period of accelerated economic recovery. That is at least the thrust of the government, is to accelerate our economic recovery trajectory. It is to engender growth that is inclusive. It is the thrust of the government, who are the stewards of the economy, to share the prosperity of our country. We are also seized with restructuring and rebalancing our economy so that we can transform it. And at the same time, we are going through fundamental reconstruction in a post-COVID world, because things have changed, the global economy has changed, and countries also need to adapt in order for them to be able to compete in a fast-changing global environment. And in case we did not realize it, it is really our generation as young Namibians that is living through a defining moment of demographic transition. Demographic transition that is pivotal by age, by gender, by political representation. We are seeing the intensification of actors within our socio-political landscape, and we, I believe, are at the forefront of this demographic and socio-political transition. So just as our generation is going through these paradigm shifts and defining our renaissance, you know, there are also forces that we are contending with that are profound. Technology is rapidly evolving, it's pervasive. We have no choice, we have to embrace, adapt, and consume it. And I think as Africans, we must have agency to become owners and developers of the technology, because if technology is not cascaded to cultural context, to indigenous realities, it can become a tool for oppression as well, because the owner of the technology will dictate and they will design it, it will be fit for purpose within their cultural context. Climate change has become a real force. I believe the wars of the future are going to be around energy and water. And this is all these are the forces that are driving us into a post-COVID world. So I think that these are the forces that we are contending with, and we must define how we're going to evolve and to exist within this space, this world that we're designing. This brings me to the end of my review, and I'll now yield the floor back to the moderator so that we can have an interactive discussion. I want to invite anyone that has read the book to reflect on some of the points that she highlighted. And if that is not the case, then I can obviously take the session away. But I think this is a good opportunity to really hear what were some of your thoughts across the different chapters as you were reading the book. Could you relate? Were there some contradictions in your opinion? Or were there specific themes that you felt like she really emphasized that you also picked it up? And when you compare it to the Namibian context, you can interpret in this way. The beautiful thing about reviews is this. There is no necessarily right or wrong, okay? There is, of course, you need to make sure that you capture the central themes of the book, but in terms of interpreting it, you could relate to the situation at your village, you could relate to your job context, you could relate it to so many different things. So I'm curious, we are interested to also draw from you, as you've heard her review, how would you say from what you were reading, how would you reflect on some of this? Do you agree? Do you have questions? Are there contradictions you picked up? The floor is all yours. I see a hand. I love hands.
There's something that I learned earlier this week, and it's that there's three businesses in this world. There's my business, there's your business, and there's God's business, right? So, with this man who wrote about the oppressed, would it be right for him to be involved in the you business? Because he is not, sorry to be racist, black. Would it be right for him to be saying, to be talking about these things when he doesn't really know the scale, the depth of what these people went through? He can only imagine it.
I was going through the book. Just when it was posted that is the book that we are going to read, I went to do my research, and I only read the preface, and yeah, I understood what the book is going to say from the preface. And the conclusions and the review that Miss Daisry made, she made one important point that that the writer belongs to the group of the middle incomes, that these are found as the people that understand and the people that can withstand colonialism. Because in society you'll find that there are these individuals who do not understand when they are oppressed. So the writer and the other people that are a bit educated, a bit experienced, and maybe living close to, that understand that they are oppressed. So that point was very important, that the writer encourages the mass to understand when they are oppressed, and this will take place through, the masses to understand that they are being oppressed. Not only the middle income, that word, those guys. So we need to take this understandability of understanding when you are colonized to the masses. Otherwise, we only have single people that are fighting colonialism and things. So let's take it to the masses, and then we'll have the masses fighting for the rights and fighting colonialism.
I haven't read the full book yet. I'm still trying to locate a hard copy, if anyone can suggest where I can find one. But I read summaries and I've done my research about it. I just feel, I agree with Ms. Daisry's interpretation. I just feel that it's really about how we understand the word oppressed, because it's not a permanent thing, and I think that is where we got stuck. It's a constant learning curve, and it just shows us that we need to be open-minded to things. And that is one thing I feel personally we have a problem with in this country. We can see the growth. It's occurring clearly. We're having sit-downs like these. These are not things or platforms you really find on a daily basis. I just feel like it starts there. So that was my understanding of the summary that I got. And especially when he speaks about violence, that violence is the answer, I guess. When we were younger, that was the route to discipline and the answer. And clearly, for others it did not work, and for others it worked. So that is how I place the open-mindedness. We can't use one solution to every problem. It cannot work. Thank you.
In this book, you really gives a guide on what are the key things that you can follow to make sure that at the end of the day, when you attain independence, or how you go about attaining independence, this is the type of society, the type of nation that you end up building at the end of the day. So what I picked up from your three comments combined is that, he starts off very radical. He says, you know what, to make a new man, you need to get rid of the old. You need to, for the black man to be fully man, you need to recreate him through physical violence. That's obviously going to war in their lives. So now, going into our discussion, I want us to interrogate, in our context, what would violence look like? Daisry mentioned economic emancipation. So how would we then wage the war on gaining economic liberty? Somebody spoke about public education. Somebody spoke about relating to the struggles and challenges of the everyday person, the layman on the ground, in where she was making the point and saying he could not relate. He could relate. He's an Algerian citizen. So now you can relate to the economic struggle of all Namibian youth, right? It doesn't have to be youth necessarily. You can relate to that. But then again, one of the strong points that Fanon makes is on public education for the masses. And at the same time, bringing your point across, it's the conversation around making sure that we are all on the same page. So Daisry, I want to bring us into some reflections to look at some of the themes that are running through this book, to look at contextually, looking at what Fanon was speaking about. What would violence look like today for us, and what are we waging war against? And also public education for our context, taking from his writings, what would it look like? Would this qualify? This platform here, would it qualify as public education? Do we need to go into the regions and sit under a tree and call the headmen and speak to them on topical issues around economic emancipation? And most importantly, the generational transition of violence. In this context, in 1961, it was about gaining freedom from the colonizers. In the early 90s, or in the early 80s, it was something else. It was about building states and putting up institutions. Now, for the born-free generations, what would violence look like? Would Fanon's writings still then apply to that particular context? Yeah.
Thank you for all those. I was listening intently. Mekonjo Fanon was an Afro-Caribbean. So we relate with our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean. We consider them to be part of Africa when we're doing our geopolitical negotiations, because we've shared similar experiences of colonialism, imperialism, oppression and dispossession, and we relate on the ethnic racial card. You're right to question his legitimacy based on lived experience. Like, I also observed that he was part of a middle class. He was not necessarily part of the poor masses. But I think you do not have to be affected in order for you to relate and to understand the struggle. And that is why he qualified the statement to say that there is a need for leadership, there is a need for enlightenment, there is a need for organization. I want to make the example of our ruling party, which waged the war for liberation of our country, because they waged a three-pronged war. It was diplomatic, it was political, and then when we had no other choice, because we were let down by the International Court of Justice on a technicality, and they would not rule the occupation of South Africa in Namibia or Southwest Africa at the time as illegal. When they failed to give us that favorable ruling that could bring an end to our oppression, that was when one of our leaders said that we are going to have to cross many rivers of blood. So by any means necessary, and that is when we waged the war for liberation. The armed struggle was born. So when we went into the bush, that generation of our founders, they went in as revolutionaries. They went in under uprising to overthrow a regime that was oppressive, that would not give us the space to self-determine. But the moment that we obtained independence in 1990, we changed from revolutionaries to transactional leaders, because now we had a responsibility to govern, to build a nation, to unite, to manage the risks, because there was a lot of distrust and tension with the previous administration. We went into a transactional style of leadership. So what I'm trying to say is that just because that person is not necessarily wearing the hat of a revolutionary because of their role and function in society at the time, does not take away the revolutionary spirit that ignited them initially. Now, in terms of, answering the question of what are the forces now, what are we contending with, I think we know what we're up against, and I alluded to it. It's overcoming the class society to an extent, it's patriarchy, it's, there are debates. The far extreme is communism, the middle ground is socialism, and then you've got the free world capitalism and neoliberalism. And, in Namibia, we practice capitalism with socialist characteristics. What that means is that the government has a dual responsibility in terms of our political ideology. We believe that we will create the space for those Namibians who have got the ability and the resources to thrive, to compete and thrive. But we also have a duty to take care of the most vulnerable members of our society, and those are the socialist characteristics. And we have to do this acknowledging that there are members of our society who are less advantaged than others. This is fueled by the rural-urban divide, which I think is still a factor if you look at young people, economic participation and inclusion. If you look at financial inclusion, more young people are excluded in the rural, remote areas of the country. I think there's also divides in terms of things like the types of labor. Some are able to use their minds, some are hard physical labor. In terms of participation in the economy, what the government is really trying to create through this age of economic transformation and reconstruction is to create more equitable participation for the masses of Namibians. We want more Namibians to be owners and managers of productive economic asset. That means having young people participating in the economy actively and formally and owning assets of the economy. That means access to land, that means access to education. That means access to leverage, to resources in the economy in order for you to be able to be productive. I think those are the forces we're up against. I don't want to go into urban housing. I don't want to go into the pandemic and the lockdowns and all of that. But these are some of the areas that I believe will define how effectively we wage a war in the third phase towards economic emancipation. The words of Andimba Toivo are coming to my mind. May his soul rest in peace. And he was saying that the second phase of the struggle is going to be much harder than the first phase because economic liberty is personal. So in a free market system, it's about competitiveness, it's about survival of the fittest. It's really about who has got access to those resources. But I believe that, the policy frameworks that this government has put in place should indicate to you the intent is redistribution, it's sharing, it's equitable participation, it's bringing more people in, it's cascading and bringing it down to the masses so that we don't create unintended consequences where you empower the already empowered elite. When we came in as transactional leaders, we took off our revolutionary hat. We said we need to affirmatively, to affirm previously disadvantaged Namibians through affirmative action laws. We use different sectors of our economy to affirm these members of our society. But the lessons there, I think now in the third decade of independence, is really what we're trying to achieve through NIAB, is to say how do we make it more equitable so that you do not continue to empower or enrich those who have already received access to benefits.
He himself is a middle-class gentleman, yet he was very critical of the role of the intellectual in terms of the nation-building project. Now, when I look at the Namibian context, where we have classes as well, we have the middlemen as well. Would you say that, because he was very radical, that no, you shouldn't empower them, the people to empower are the masses, you need to go to the peasants. But then the question obviously is who then will do the empowering? Who is so enlightened to actually do the empowering if not the middle class themselves? Let's try and sort of tie this line of thinking to our context and sort of look at, so if we are to say the only way to enlighten the masses is you need to do public education, but then we look at the realities around us. You mentioned technology could at the end of the day also work against you. You mentioned, I guess, access to information as well could also work against you. I'm just curious to really know, in our current context, what would the middle class enlightening the masses really look like? Outside of technical jargon like policies and the likes, what exactly do we need to do to make sure that, for example, at a small scale, if this platform exists to embrace a culture of reading and by virtue of that enlighten the masses, what are some of the very practical steps that one could take to make sure that it's rolled out into the regions. I'm not giving you plans to go on a tour or anything like that. But I want to relate it to really like, what would the lady, the daughter of the lady selling kapana in single quarters today, you know, what would enlightenment really look like? And when we say that our battle at the moment is economic emancipation, what would her weapons look like at the end of the day? And I think secondly also, I want us to reflect on his second last chapter, or his final chapter before the conclusion, where he really touches on wellness, the state of mental health in a country. And of course, at that particular context, he's speaking about, you know, the effects, the trauma that came with the liberation struggle. But now we are sitting here 31 plus years later, and, you know, this trauma still lingers in the soil of this country. So then what is it that we can do to reignite the conversation around wellness? Obviously taking into consideration that we have a generation of our forefathers that have not healed. We have our generation from the 80s onwards that are equally struggling with trauma. And we have the newborn, the born frees, equally having their own traumas. I mean, COVID-19 as an example, we had so many people coming out, you know, talking about depression and the likes. So the evolutionary nature of wellness from the time that Fanon was writing to where we are now, you know, what is it that we can do to sort of enlighten the young Namibian youth leader on this particular issue?
But let me begin by quoting Fanon, because his writing was very clear, and it's the first time I'm hearing that. He was providing a toolkit of how to do it, because he was very explicit in the guidance. Here's a quote that he gave on education. He says, "To educate, quote unquote, to educate the masses politically cannot mean making a political speech. What it means is to try to relentlessly and passionately teach the masses that everything depends on them. That if we stagnate, it is their responsibility, and that if we go forward, it is due to them going forward. That there is no such thing as a demiurge, that there is no famous man who will take responsibility for everything, but that the demiurge, which is like the strong man, the figurehead, is the people themselves, and that the magic hands are finally only the hands of the people." So he really believed in self-definition. He believed in the importance of the individual in realizing the collective transformation of the group. And I feel that Fanon was really saying that leadership must be cascaded to every level of society. And everybody assuming a leadership position, whether you are a teacher or a cleaner or a nurse or a mother or a father or a pastor, that we need to be able to cascade the responsibility of leadership to every level of responsibility. This removes the pressure and the stampede to get to the top, to the apex, to provide that leadership role. That is the first point that I wanted to highlight on education, but I think your question was very explicit on what does it look like and how do we do it in our environment today. Enlightenment, there's formal and there's informal education. Let's begin with the formal education, which is the educational system of the country. In terms of sociology, there are 5 pillars that uphold any society. It's the nuclear family, the core. It's the community that you're growing up in, the role modeling and the relational constellations that are in those communities. It is the education system that you are pushed through by your family and your country. It is the moral and ethical institutions, value institutions like the churches. And finally, it's the law, the constitution, the supreme law of the land. You know, these are the pillars that uphold any society. So if we are talking about the education of the Namibian child, we have to take that holistic approach to education. That education does not only happen in a classroom. Education is happening at home. Education is happening on the street, in the community. Education is happening in institutions like the churches, value-based. Education is happening through law that sets the standard, the acceptable standard for public conduct and behavior. And education is happening informally in settings like these through exchange and engagement. from a formal education point of view, and I think this is now the duty and the obligation of the state, is to make, and it's a right that is constitutionally entrenched for the Namibian child to have access to education and to have the right to pursue knowledge and enlightenment. Our government has done that through, I think we are all very familiar with universal access to education. We have waived the fee and shifted that burden from the Namibian families to the government. It's not that education is free, it's just that the government is carrying the cost and is highly subsidizing the cost of education at the primary and the secondary level. At the tertiary level, it's a bit more of a hybrid. I still want to contend, and I know that this could put me into dangerous water, I still want to contend that government is making a very significant contribution to tertiary education, higher learning in Namibia, even if it is not 100% free. We must consider that the institutions that are delivering that education are highly subsidized, 60% NAST, 70% UNAM, and also through the Financial Assistance Fund. That fund is 30% a loan, 70% a grant in terms of the commitment that the government is giving to the learner. So the cost of education is highly subsidized. Even if you are studying towards engineering and you are paying 85,000 for that engineering degree, the real cost of that engineering degree must be 300,000. It's just that the state has highly subsidized a lot of it. So that is the contribution of the state to education, to making sure that it is more accessible, to making sure that it is more equitable. Over the years, we have overcome gender parity, where the girls have adequately gained access to the classroom. We have introduced progressive policies like permitting pregnant adolescent girls to continue their education until it's time for them to go and deliver their baby safely, so that we can protect and safeguard those gains, because we don't want to lose them through those natural process. Then there's informal education, which I think is really happening at the communal level, at the people-to-people level, at the cultural exchange level, and this possibly is the most important form of education as well. And this is where it touches on who we are as a post-conflict society, the premise, the context, the lens that we are seeing the world through. There is a need for us to have a lot of tolerance, because there's still a lot of fractures within our mindset. We were divided along our differences. We were told to disassociate based on what made us different. Yeah. And even though we have a born-free generation, that is only the first generation after independence, who is 31 years old today. So we still need a lot of time in order for us to overcome those mental barriers and begin to see us more on commonality, on what unites us, because we have more in common than what separates us. But it is a system that has really trained our minds to think exclusively of each other. This is what is perpetuating tribalism and ethnic, racial intolerance. It's also what fuels the violence that we see along sexual and gender-based and even economic lines. It's embedded in some of this. Cyberbullying and trolling is embedded in intolerance. So I think this is where we probably need to define what is the acceptable standard. And we need to collectively reject in public when we see those manifestations that actually can cause reversal and regression of the unity that we're trying to forge ahead as a generation. I think this is the only way we'll achieve harmony and cohesion going forward. But the forces we are contending are so divisive, so we have to be more determined to stand as a united front.
The nuggets in here are a lot. And I think now that we've sort of got the conversation going, you know, taking us back to his very first words in the first few pages, the last shall be first and first last, and bringing it into the cancel culture that we have today, and also at the same time bringing into consideration that at some point each one of us, if not all of us, have gone through the trauma that is struggling with imposter syndrome. You know, because again, where we are coming from has sort of framed the culture around which we think of ourselves, we think of the other. in his book, Fanon also talks about the importance of framing a common national culture. And the memory politics that sort of build into that narrative is very, very important. I think all of us are very familiar with Namibian history, where it is said we come from. And he was emphasizing that, look, before you identify as X, you need to ask yourself, the history you're embracing, is it the history that you are told by the colonizer, or is it the history that you are taught, again, the public education, that you are told by your liberators? And if it is a history you are told by the liberators, is it a history that, there's a point in the book where he says, the liberators must watch out so they don't get into the space of, reminding us of, the past victories. But at the same time, he emphasizes the importance of knowing where you come from. What I found very interesting about his writing on national culture is that we need to also question some of the worldviews that we hold dearly. We need to question them and ask ourselves, is this necessarily a worldview that speaks to my innate being? Again, remember at the beginning he says, for the black man to be, you need to recreate the black man, not to emulate the colonizer, but to be himself, to rise into himself. And of course he says, violence is the way to go. Now we don't have that in our current context. I think the question now is just going forward, how should we reflect on the narrative around a common national culture? What is our common national culture as Namibians? What is that thing that we can say, this truly makes me authentically Namibian? And I embrace this way of thinking based on the fact that I'm embracing the culture or the memory culture that was taught to me by my own people, not by the colonizers. What were your thoughts when you were reading some of those things?
These questions of identity are really pertinent questions as we reflect on national culture, national identity, and heal national psyche. There is a generation of Namibians who legitimately are still trying to answer that question. This is a generation of Namibians who were born and raised to be defenders of the revolution. They grew up in refugee camps outside of Namibia. They were young but militant, trained to fight, to usher Namibia into an epoch of peace and prosperity. And many of them grew but did not really have the opportunity, because of the sequence of timing and events, did not really have that opportunity to be the defenders, to put on the armed uniform and to go to war. They wanted to fight. Many of them, when Namibia got their independence, they were still too young. They were 16, 17, and they cried because they realized they would not have that opportunity to manifest that role, which for them was the very purpose of their being. So they came back to Namibia confused, like what must happen now? Because my whole orientation is to be a freedom fighter. They had to be reintegrated into a community that they do not know. Many of them were born in Nyango and Lubango and in the refugee camps. So they had to come back, learn a language, relate with the people, and adopt cultural practices that were quite foreign to them, but were quite inherently who they were. Then there's a second phase of, I'm entering into identity of expectation, which was leadership. We are the defenders of the revolution. We will also take over the political, governance, economic, social architecture of Namibia as the heirs, rightly so, as the heritage, as the prodigies. And there's been a waiting period for that generation. They find themselves, I find, in a state of flux, probably feeling very unfulfilled with their contribution to the development of their country, because they feel that they have forfeit or they missed an opportunity on the political liberation side, and now they feel that they are probably not adequately in charge of the economic factors of production in order for them to drive the crusade from an economic deliverance point of view. So that is one type of Namibian that I think even if you and I were not born out of exile and did not have that experience, we must be conscious, we must be mindful, we must be sensitive that we are not homogeneous and that we have had very different experiences, and we must be able to understand each other and where we are coming from. In terms of, I want to quote Marcus Garvey. He said, on identity, he said, "The world has made being black a crime. I intend to make being black a virtue." And I think there's truth in that, because we need to transform our psyche, our orientation, based on how we were taught from the very foundations. The educational system, that I made a confession to say that I was really oriented towards the European side. I came to learn African literature by choice as an adult. So my whole world view was really shaped by external and not necessarily the forces that are closer to home or the realities that are closer to my realities. So I do think that we need to transform any form of hatred that exists between ourselves into the hatred of the oppression, into the hatred of the obstacles, into the hatred of what separates us and impedes us from achieving freedom as we define it. We have defined our freedom as economic, as manifestation of potential, as ownership of economic assets. We are defining our freedom, I think, relatively within a spectrum of dimensions, right? Indicators. It means different things to different people. But what I'm saying is that we need to be able to transform our minds intentionally, consciously, through self-awareness, to be able to manage those presets, because the presets are there, the filters are there, the pre-orientations are there. And we must be able to say that if this thing is taking me away, it's taking me away from unity, if this thing is taking me away from being a more patriotic Namibian, or whatever the case may be, this is the enemy. So defining the enemy from a point of what makes you less Namibian, defining the enemy from what makes you less African, and what makes you more relevant to your generation at a very psychological level. And I also think in our space now, in our context, it's beyond racial. Before then, it was a black man and a white man. It was very obvious. But now, let's honestly concede that there's gender inequities, there's sexual orientation inequities, there's still, maybe not in Africa, but you can see in the West, white supremacy and how that's playing out. So for us, it's no longer just about the racial card. I think we have to consciously manage these types of inequities, these types of exclusions from different areas. Patriarchy is one of them, and that translates into the gender inequities. So that is my contribution on that.
Awesome. So obviously to the revolutionary-oriented reader, they will look this as a call to really, go and fight physically, go and create havoc. But then what was interesting, Daisry, the more I spent time with this book, I realized that given our current context where the warfare is not necessarily against that person or this person, it's more against the issues of the day. When you read this book from the back to the front, you realize you get a model that could actually work very well for you. Because in chapter 5, really, he more or less raises your awareness to the reality that, you need to make sure that from a wellness perspective, you're doing well. And then he goes on to now that you have taken care of your wellness, you need to go on an exercise of understanding where you fit within the conversation around national culture. But be careful that you don't fall into some of the pitfalls around being an enlightened and intellectual young person, and also be very, very wise around how you display your strength as an intellectual middle class. And when all things fail, resort to violence. That's how I sort of interpreted it, from backwards and say, we're not just going to start by, going to fight physically, but maybe let the first battle be from within. So I want to invite some of you, having heard us do this to and fro, what are your thoughts on Wretched of the Earth, and how do you identify, are you the wretched? Is the wretched an issue outside of you? And if so, would you say that, hey, I went to this review of this book and it sounded like a lot of political jargon, or goodness gracious, you know, something clicked in my subconscious and, you know, this is sort of how it challenged me. But before I do that, maybe you can...
I'm not going to take away from what you said, because I think you delivered a master stroke there. And I think that is the brilliance of Fanon, is really his ability to get into the mental space of the subjugated. And I do think to reverse it, is you have to do the opposite, as you rightly say. I'm reflecting on the champion that we have in our First Lady, who has really been a champion of those conversations, to say that we need to have a space for these types of open, frank dialogues that can help us to address the mental aspects of where we are as a society, as a psyche, so that we can heal and recover from these wounds. Once we do that, we are in a better position to lead a crusade on restructuring the institutions. The institutions are not the problem, but the institutions are led by people. And those people must have their values and their orientation and their minds right and their hearts right in order for them to really steward those resources in the interest of the greater collective.
Thoughts? Yes.
What does it mean to be a black man? You know what I mean? I think is certain characteristics ascribed to myself because I have this particular skin color, and therefore I think like a black man in the US, I think like a black man in the Kavango, black man in Zambezi. Even then, it's individualistic, almost like we all think differently. Yes, there's certain cultural characteristics that define us all because of our background, but if you were to recreate the black man, we're not robots, right? So you cannot, you know, it's not a uniform thing to do. Obviously, we have to fight things like racism, you know, and I think obviously in this day and age, maybe we should also obviously concentrate on things like equality and equity, you know, like Daisry was saying. I think that's important. And sometimes these inequalities are not perpetrated by individuals that are not black. I mean, in today's, you know, age, in Namibia, I mean, the black man has power. The black man, we've seen the corruption that's been taking place, right? And that's mostly, obviously, for what I've seen, obviously, perpetrated by the black man. All right, so what does it mean to recreate the black man? I mean, I think that's just something I kind of wanted to kind of go into and think, okay, maybe it's something we really need to kind of think deeply about what that means. And if we can figure that out, then maybe we can start changing society and, you know, and really rather focusing maybe on equity and equality for all, rather than just look at, oh, me, I'm black, therefore I deserve certain things, or I'm black, therefore, you know, we need to do X, Y, and Z. Just my thoughts.
My honest beginning feelings was the middle class bourgeoisie. First I felt like personally attacked, and then I was like, that's exactly what the author wanted to do with this book, because it's almost as if you want to challenge the narrative that because you almost have this, if I am in a position of leadership, then I will free the people. But what you have done is you've just replaced yourself, but the system is entirely the same. Which then got me to thinking, how practically and tangibly, without simply talking about the outcome which we wish to achieve, would you go about doing something like this? Do you just scrape democracy as a whole? Do you say, we're not going to do capitalism, socialism, we're not going to do any of it? Instead, we're going to do maybe say what our ancestors were practicing and how they ruled us back then. But then it's contradicting to me how the thought is to then, let's come up with something of our own. But then we say the only way, the author says, the only way to then perpetrate is by going through different levels of the community. And which is a democratical structure, because then you have the president, you have the ministers, you go all the way down to the chiefs of the community. So are we saying this is, through this book, through the lens of the book, are we saying this is something that is beneficial, but we're going to scrape it while coming up with something of our own? So that for me was kind of contradicting as a thought. And then just the thought which I would leave going home with is then how then do you really revolt in our generation, and practically do you revolt? When I'm in SPA and there's this Namibian urgency by people and employees of companies to almost feel like you should help the white people first. I don't know if it's just me who feels that sometimes. Or you're in a line, but someone behind you would get help first because their color is lighter than you. Do I revolt by screaming, and do I fight? How do you go about those small, practical, tangible, day-to-day type of, where you can really see the psychological effects of colonialism, where black people who of my skin color still treat me almost in a worse place than they would white people, even though the oppressor was not me, it was the white people. So the thoughts I'd be leaving home is really how do I, in my own and personal capacity, make the change.
I agree with Ma'am when she reflected on this. Are we still oppressed as we are? Because as Ma'am Daisry was going through the review, from the first chapter, I could ask myself a question based on the analysis: am I an oppressed person? Is my community still oppressed? As we go ahead with the book, I could analyze that somehow there's still a hierarchy of, the colonizers being part of the economic, being part of, ruling us. Even in public education, they are still leading. The system of education that we are following, it still feels like we are being oppressed. So I keep asking myself this question: am I free, or am I still oppressed? And I feel like perhaps if I read the book, I might understand, I might reflect better. But based on her analysis and the review, I could still ask myself that question. I feel like I'm not free. We are still not free. As much as we feel like we are still free, I don't think we are free.
I agree with what they're saying. I just feel when it comes to scraping the black man into someone else, I just feel like how I understand it is it's basically giving the black man opportunity to identify himself as a person. That is how I feel the scraping, because we've been made into who we are because of the historical background or influence and distractions or whatnot. So I feel like the scraping just kind of allows you as an individual within yourself to just decide who you are in the community. That's how I understood the interpretation of scraping. Yes.
I will say the book is history. It's happened 1960s. It was a long time ago. It was a time of actual violence and things. And currently, this is not happening anymore. But oppression is still happening in certain ways, as it was mentioned, like maybe in terms of economic dependency, and you still see that the black community, it's still being oppressed. So now, after this book was written, there were solutions later on that were happened to also to create a solution between colonialism and the tension between the whites and the blacks. Like after independence, there were the black and white reconciliation movements. This happened in South Africa by Nelson Mandela, and also these Ubuntu things. So now we are at the point where oppression is happening in some other ways, but what I stress is now we have to be individuals or masses that know what to do when we are oppressed. Are you going to be oppressed and be a victim while you are attending such as these things, reading these books that are opening you to do something when you are oppressed? So, in this society now, I recommend that we are not going to be oppressed. We will do something. And we will seek to do something if we don't know what to do. That's what I stress. Thank you.
And we must understand the context in which literature was written back then was in I'm not an English person, but because in their mindset, they used to use the word like the we as the people must do this. But then basically when it comes to the we as the people, within the we of the people, there is an I as an individual. What is my role as an individual to a certain particular aim or objectives that I am trying to look forward to? Let me say, for instance, in this, let me not create a lecture now, but I have to explain it, because I did a lot of notes and I was... Now, because we are having a circle here, your interest when you read the literature of the Wretched of the Earth, what makes you unhappy and what gives you that core, what causes that belly of yours to be pondering on too much? I will read the same text, but then something comes up, pops up, and that's how it is. And basically, when he speaks of violence, I will not talk about the past, because history is learned and then we must relearn it, because it's just reoccurrence of events. Basically, when it comes to violence in our day's objectives, when you emphasized earlier, violence, I will define it in our days, because I simply have this up and down with my lectures. For me, there is what we call intellectual bullying. Basically, I never thought of the word intellectual bullying until I came up. I was thinking like, man, people are saying bully. But then what happens when it comes to intellectual bullies? Now, I came across a professor from Nigeria, I forgot the lady's name, who wrote about intellectual bully. An intellectual bully is a professor who thinks he knows more than the learner. Basically, because when you write your thesis or what you write, what you believe in, what your day-to-day, the realities of what is happening, it's not in the literatures of the books that we are being read, being taught. It does not reflect with the mind of the professor, because the professor comes from a different era. Now, the two cannot meet to a specific line where we can say, oh, you've gone through this is where I'm coming from. If I come from the village and he comes from the urban areas, our life, it's totally different. How you respond to certain events is not the same way I respond now. Where do you find that intellectual level of us coming together now? That's the intellectual violence that is happening and reoccurring, and it's in universities. And that's why you find out that there is a high number of dropouts in universities. It's not because I'm not passionate about literature and reading. It's because the professor because me and you are in discourse, I'll give you a 0 plainly because of it. You are wasting my time, I get paid, I want to go home. And then basically on the other spontaneity and strength and weaknesses now. Basically now, when it comes to Franz Fanon, he speaks on the psychology of the man because he was a psychiatrist. Now, when you look at something in the narrative of as a young person now in this day and era, you find out that we focus more on the weaknesses that deteriorate, and it makes us unhuman, it makes us wretched, it dehumanizes us ourselves. Other than us looking at the strength, what can I contribute as an individual? Because it's no longer a we, but it's an I now as a person. What can I contribute to my family, to my community where I grew up, and then to the large extent? And then it goes into the weaknesses now, like, because people will know that you have certain weaknesses, and then you build up now, finding a room for it to improve on. And the other thing is on the national consciousness. Basically, when it comes to the national consciousness, we are a democratic society. And with democracy, there's political parties and political beliefs, genders, and certain things. Now, in Namibian context, we have too many ethnicities and tribes and whatsoever. Now, because me as an individual, I will not say I'm a Namibian first, but for sake to be truthful, I'm a Vambu first, and then if I'm with other Vambus first, I'm a Kwanyama. When I'm with the other Kwanyamas, I'm like Ondinkwanangobe. You see, you classify yourself in which space you are as a person. If you go international, you can't say no, I'm a Kwanyama, but you identify yourself as a Namibian. But then it comes out now with the national, the way forward of national consciousness. We have institutions, as you have emphasized. We have too many, I'm not saying too many, but the two most say they are underfunded and under-resourced. which is the National Service and the National Youth Council, which was supposed to play a major role, because a major role at the National Youth Service, I've never been there, but I applied when I was a kid to attend it. With the National Youth Service, it's supposed to be like a conscription. For us to, as Namibians, to have an identity within ourselves so that we can learn as a Boer, as a Tswana, how do we reflect ourselves, how do we behave amongst the colours. When the colours start having that aggressiveness when they talk, you are like, I can't be talking like that. He does not have manners, but it's his culture. Now, how do we have that space that we are inclusive of everyone? And that, sorry for taking too long. When it comes to war and mental disorder, basically when it comes to war and mental disorder, there's a line, a biblical line that says, laws are created out of sin. For a law to be a law, somebody has to do something which is inhumane, that it surpasses something else for them to create a law. A law does not a person who pops up like, no, hey, this is a law now. For somebody, there must be a space, and somebody has to penetrate within that space. And then people say, no man, there's a gap, let's close it so that nobody repeats it. That's how laws are created. And that's how wars are originated. Now, for us, we do not have physical wars nowadays, but our wars are more of psychological and spoken words. How can I hammer you psychologically and other things which not go to the technological aspects which is happening now. So basically, and the mental disorders and the post-COVID was what I have observed is, and which is I even talk to my friends about this over and over again. It's very dangerous that what is happening now. Universities, if you have to look at the rate at mental disorders that is happening into young kids, suicide and whatsoever, there's a peak when you're in university and then suddenly somebody just snaps. Okuriko psychiatric ward, 16. Schizophrenia, bipolar, whatever the moods, and there's that energy that is coming up and it's on a high rise, like causing themselves to ask themselves more of a philosophical question, what is the meaning and their role in living? And mental disorder, you find that mental disorder is also in offices and whatsoever. There was let me just conclude now. There was a talk, a lady emphasized one important question. He says, I am mentally ill and I was just chased out of my work because he's not fit for work. Now, what laws, because the Minister of Justice is here, what are laws that guides a person that protects people who the high, because this is on the increase and it's going to be it's how do we protect the people who are going through this and the stigma and the whatsoever? We are just like, because I suffer from bipolar, and this I had, when I was with Cannibal, may his soul rest in peace. I was with Cannibal in the same cell. He was telling me his stories, what he was doing on the radio and stuff like that. And then I told him, Kani, I'm working on some ideas, but when we are out here, I will do something. And then I found Kani at the College of the Arts. And then I'm like, Kani, I came to visit you. Man, I was working on this idea. And then Kani said, brah, do not talk about mental health, brah. Can we not call me or something? And I'm like, what? Brah, the same people that who are instigating mental health will be the ones who are oppressing you. Will be the ones who are against you, like working it against you. Later on, I'm like, really? And then he said, yeah, brah, they think like a kukush. Like I'm not, even my thinking, even my ideas bring me to the table. It has to be, even politically, you find people saying, hey, you are bipolitical, you are bipolar, whatsoever. But we have to grow into a space of that. And you reading The Wretched of the Earth, basically with his all other black literatures, it just basically says, a society must just outgrow itself within like, is it Manzedo who said, we don't care if the cat is black or white as long as it can catch mice. And people are trying to, when one dominant, society becomes dominant, like the Chinese now. They are more dominant. Everybody wants to study the model of how the Chinese did it. The mixture of socialism and capitalism. How did they come? And those things are also playing an effect. Now everybody is going to that without them understanding their own cultural behaviors.
It dawned on me that for me personally, I lived with the narrative that we are liberal, you know, and that is because of our political liberation. And when it was mentioned, for instance, people that turn to robberies and so on, it made me realize that liberation does not start and end when oppression ends. You know, we still need to look into the effects that come from it. You know, we have issues said as daddy issues, for instance, and if we look at the said daddy, the people who actually contribute to the daddy issues, for instance, are fathers who were absent from their own parents, or their parents were absent because they were fighting for our political independence. And I think it also dawned on me when Ms. Daisry mentioned that self-definition is quite important, because then it helps us avoid the blueprint and just forge our own paths, you know.
I do want to read a quote by someone else who also plays a very, very important role in the decolonization of the oppressed mind, and that's Paulo Freire. Now, and I want to maybe answer just very briefly the question that you're asking about what should we be doing, you know, if we want to really deconstruct the oppressed mind. And that is, you flood your schools with the kind of reading that's going to shape the kind of society that you want to see. Because like Daisry, I really grew up during apartheid, and I knew everything about the Afrikaner Boereoorlog back in the day. And I understood, you know, how apartheid happened. I understood 1911 and the independence of South Africa at the time. I think many, if they didn't understand it, would probably understand it now. So the kind of reading that you had, and so when I went to do my master's, the African scholars that I met from across the continent were talking about Chinua Achebe and Things Fall Apart. A reading that you wouldn't have had during apartheid, because they wouldn't want you to understand what it means to decolonize the mind. So Pedagogy of the Oppressed, really by Paulo Freire, summarizes what that education should look like. And I want to quote, because when I was re-looking at Frantz Fanon, because I have read this book many, many years ago, so I had to kind of remind myself. But I want to read, and I quote, unquote, and it says, "The oppressed who have been shaped by the death-affirming climate of oppression must find through their struggle the way to life-affirming humanization, which does not lie simply in having more to eat, although it does involve having more to eat and cannot fail to include this aspect. The oppressed have been destroyed precisely because their situation has reduced them to things. In order to regain their humanity, they must cease to be things and fight as men and women. This is a radical requirement. They cannot enter the struggle as objects in order later to become human beings. The struggle begins with men's recognition that they have been destroyed. Propaganda, management, manipulation, all arms of domination cannot be the instruments of their rehumanization. The only effective instrument is a humanizing pedagogy in which the revolutionary leadership establishes a permanent relationship of dialogue with the oppressed." In a humanizing pedagogy, the method ceases to be an instrument by which the teachers, in this instance the revolutionary leadership, can manipulate the students, in this instance the oppressed, because it expresses the consciousness of the students themselves. When we read books, it's really an opportunity to either get affirmation for what you already know, or to learn new ways of doing things. Fanon said it. If you read the conclusion, he talked about new way of doing things. Vision 2030 said it. If you want to reach the vision for this 30 years that we had planned to do, then what we wanted to achieve is a new way of doing things. If you read another book that I also like, and some books are not there for discussion, is the one by Sigmund Freud, Civilization and Its Discontents. There's a number of books, if you have them in your collection, if you read them seriously and you reflect seriously, it will change the way you think about things. There are only two things I want to say in conclusion. The one is, Fanon was asking us to do something he himself could not do, which is really to do without what we think the tools are that we've been given by colonialism. So there's a huge debate around whether or not it's even possible, in the kinds of societies that we live, to do what has been asked of us. But the important point is, as whom do we identify? If you read Black Skin, White Mask, you will see that typically colonialists uses those that they have colonized to drive their agenda. They don't need themselves. They can stand back and you will do the work for Gucci. Gucci doesn't have to do anything. All we do all the time is to reaffirm the things that we use as tools to oppress us.
What does it mean to be a black man? How can I contribution to my personal and collective emancipation? And am I really free? And I think in your reflections, you helped us to especially on the question of identity. What is not yours is what you should reject. What makes me an African man or a Namibian woman is everything that makes me less Namibian and less African. What contribution can I make in this season, in this era? What is the oppression? Have we defined the oppression? I think we've defined the oppression. So your contribution should be to intentionally undo those shackles of oppression, which means supporting local enterprise, which means negotiating trade from a nationalistic point of view. I live to see the day that the DRC will out-negotiate Europe on just trade tariffs for our natural resources, because again, Africa is building different continents. Am I really free? I think the answer came from the colleague. She said, freedom is progressive, and freedom is not absolute. Yes, you have political freedom. We the people, you have a government for the people, by the people. We're a republic. Yes, we have attained a measure of freedom. But I think to be truly free, there's a next and a third and a fourth step. And that is now, embedded in our ability to decolonialize the mind. It's also embedded in our ability, once we have decolonialized the mind, to steward the resources so that there is broad-based shared prosperity and access. Then we can be truly free. I'm reminded of Ambassador Andrew Young, the American ambassador, and he said to be truly free, overcome the fear of death and the love of wealth. Only then you'll be truly free. And I think, as we confront decoloniality, it's about untangling knowledge. In education systems, it's about untangling knowledge in a lot of sectors, indigenous medicine, in science, in technology, and imbibing the type of information, knowledge, data that is authentic and true to our context. Then I believe that we'll be on our way to becoming truly free. I just want to say thank you very much for the, I think, even vulnerable conversations that we're having. I think this is definitely a safe space, The note that I want to leave on is that what is unique and peculiar about Namibia is our diversity. And you really articulated it so well to say we identify and stratify to the granular. We'll go to the clan when we have to in order for us to preserve our individuality, you know, and our unique identity. But there's a space for individuality. There's a space for you to identify ethnically, tribally, racially, and there's a space for us to be able to identify as Namibians first, and then as Africans. What has been our undoing, what the enemy used against us, is that very diversity, which is supposed to be our strength. They use that to divide and conquer. That is why we struggle with common language. We are trying to learn Swahili, but some reject Swahili, say why Swahili if it's Oshiwambo, because we don't have that overarching sense of identity. And we're not prepared to embrace a common African identity. And I really put it to you that Africa is going to rise when we are able to unite as one. Sankara said, for the nation to rise, the tribe must fall. And I believe it, without undermining the importance of tribal identity, without undermining the role of, you know, of that layer of socialization. It is important that we know when to put it aside and to relate as an African first with a Namibian passport, or a Namibian who answers an Oshiwambo name. And that is when I think we'll be able to really have a united front and contend with the forces that are dividing us, psychological warfare. Thank you very much to all of you for your contributions. I certainly learned so much. I'm going to hand over to the moderator, who's going to tell us the next recommended title for the month of February.
Packed with so much for us to take away. I think if one were even to attempt what just float in this room today, that's another book on its own, right? But I think in terms of our consciousness, there should be a call to action. The minister highlighted the formal call to action, but then the informal call to action is take the conversation further beyond this world. You know, go and engage with other people, talk to them about this, tell them this is the book to have. If you don't have this book, get it this year. This is one of many. You can even engage with the minister afterwards and ask her for the titles of the other books, tiny books that she has in her hands, but are equally powerful. So I guess Dynamite comes in small packages. But with that said, we've come to the end of our first official session for the year, book 1 of 12. So we have a lineup of 11 more. They won't necessarily be as heavy, but they will be equally enlightening. I think what I do want to say, for the sake of better engagement for the next discussion, which will be taking place on the 26th of February, we will be discussing Purple Hibiscus by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, one of our continent's treasures, if I can put it like that. Amazing author. And now what you can do is you can either get the book yourself at Book 10 or Exclusive Books. Miss Daisry managed to work out a lovely deal, not discount, but basically if you go there and say you're part of the reading club, you know, we could order the books as a group, as opposed to individually. So maybe send us an email, show interest, and then maybe we can take it a step further. So that's the book we'll be discussing next month. If you can't find the book, if you can't buy it, you can download it online. It should be somewhere online, I'm sure. I just want to say, copyright.
I discourage the downloading because we're trying to support local. We're trying to support these authors.
Yeah.
So I encourage you to get your hard copy.
Yeah.
You know, the titles are considered, they're selected on purpose because there's something that we want to learn from these texts. Book 10, we've given them the booklet, so they do pre-orders. I cannot guarantee that it will be there when you need it because they cannot say no to other clients, but at least there would be some adequate stock in anticipation that some of our community readers will be there to pick up the book. This one is known as the sequel to Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. This was Nigeria pre-independence, and then Chimamanda follows after Things Fall Apart with post-independent Nigeria, and just, you know, continues on the effects of of that society and all the forces that are shaping it. So we're really keen to get into the purple hibiscus. We read Things Fall Apart last year, and if you missed that review, it's on the YouTube channel. You can always catch up.
Yet another small read, but equally powerful. But like, don't also be feeling like now I'm left out if I can't get the book. There are online reviews as well that you can look at that will also just sort of highlight the essence of the book. Let not getting the physical copy be a deterrent for you to join the discussion next month. What I do want to share in terms of when you do your own reading, which will be very helpful for us to have a more interactive engagement, always read the book to understand the context. Follow the format she shared today, you know, the context. When was this book written? Who is the author? Who was the primary audience? Writers always write with the target in mind. What are the key messages? And then try and sort of interrogate it from asking yourself, how does this book fit within the framework of the continent called Africa? Then you bring it a step further. How does it fit within the framework of Namibia? Then you take it a step further. How do I relate to the book? So that when we come here, no, we won't come here, but when we do the virtual review, you know, in the comment section, you're already typing away. You know, as she's reviewing, you're like, I hear you, but this is how I interpret it, or I agree with you, but did you notice this? Just to make the group a bit more interactive, and also to learn from one another, because just already from this session, I can tell you, I've been challenged and stimulated in so many different ways mentally, that I want to take the conversation further and even have it with my little kids and ask them questions around, who do you say you are? Because I also want to understand, where are they? And also, what type of books must I introduce to my children? To my children, so that, you know, besides waiting for our school curriculums to be reformed, it must start at home, right? So that, of course, now they tell me that, Mami, I'm not a Shiwambo. Just like, okay, that's interesting. Let's explore that further, taking into consideration some of the things we learned here today. With that said, ladies and gentlemen, this was so lovely, and I will see you again next month.
I must respond to this gentleman's point. There is a book that was written, you know, this could have been off record, but there are three things it says. It says part of Africa's problem, and it's regrettable that it was a quotation in the book at the time. But and those things remain, and it reminded me of that book because of what he said about tribalism. He said there are three things that will stand in the prosperity of Africa. It's tribalism, it's self-interest, and greed.
Yes.
And it's really, and I'm always trying to see whether the preamble of the Namibian Constitution can be that unifying force for us. You know, when we are looking for that identity, what makes us Namibian? When we are asking that question. And really, I encourage you to try and go back to, maybe link up a little bit to what Rakkel says about how do we really relate to the preamble of the Namibian Constitution? What are we aspiring to as a nation? When we talk about liberty, justice, human dignity, and the pursuit of happiness, what does that signify for us as Namibians? And maybe that could become the unifying force that we can use to identify as Namibians. But I think at some point, honestly, we must move towards that direction. Otherwise, we will not. The tribe is not a problem, Daisry, if it is not used to exclude, if it's not used to oppress. But if you say I'm a Kwekwe Kubab speaking person, and as a result of that, I'm only harnessing, or I'm only relating to, I'm only enhancing, I'm only prospering and sharing with those groups, then you have a problem. So we really need to think about our identity as Namibians within, at least in the preambular provisions of our constitution. I think there is opportunity for us to embrace that as the kind of identity that we want. So when we say liberty, what does liberty mean, you know, for anyone in Namibia? What does dignity look like for anyone in Namibia, both as an individual and as a collective? I think we have a long conversation that we have ahead of us, but I think there's lots of exciting opportunities when you have reading clubs like this to enhance and create that knowledge for us.
Awesome.